Öresund in many extraordinary figures, in triangular and long curves, in sharp hooks and semicircles. The great reunion, held the year that Nils Holgersson travelled around with the wild geese, came Akka and her flock later than all the others, and that was not to be wondered at, for Akka had to fly over the whole of Skåne to get to Kullaberg. Besides, as soon as she awoke, she had been obliged to go out and hunt for Thumbietot, who for many hours had gone and played to the gray rats, and lured them far away from Glimminge castle. Mr. Owl had returned with the news that the black rats would be at home immediately after sunrise, and there was no longer any danger in letting the steeple owl's pipe be hushed, and to give the gray rats the liberty to go where they pleased. But it was not Akka who discovered the boy where he walked with his long following, and quickly sank down over him and caught him with the bill and swung into the air with him, but it was Herr Ermenrich, the stork, for Herr Ermenrich had also gone out to look for him, and after he had borne him up to the stork nest, he begged his forgiveness for having treated him with disrespect the evening before. This pleased the boy immensely, and the stork and he became good friends. Akka, too, showed him that she felt very kindly toward him. She stroked her old head several times against his arms, and commended him because he had helped those who were in trouble. But this one must say to the boy's credit, that he did not want to accept praise which he had not earned. "No, Mother Akka," he said, "you mustn't think that I lured the gray rats away to help the black ones. I only wanted to show Herr Ermenrich that I was of some consequence." He had hardly said this before Akka turned to the stork and asked if he thought it was advisable to take Thumbietot along to Kullaberg. "I mean that we can rely on him as upon ourselves," said she. The stork at once advised, most enthusiastically, that Thumbietot be permitted to come along. "Certainly you shall take Thumbietot along to Kullaberg, Mother Akka," said he. "It is fortunate for us that we can repay him for all what he has endured this night for our sakes. And since it still grieves me to think that I did not conduct myself in a becoming manner toward him the other evening, it is I who will carry him on my back all the way to the meeting place." There isn't much that tastes better than to receive praise from those who are themselves wise and capable, and the boy had certainly never felt so happy as he did when the wild goose and the stork talked about him in this way. Thus the boy made the trip to Kullaberg riding stork back. Although he knew that this was a great honour, it caused him much anxiety, for Herr Ermenrich was a master flyer, and started off at a very different pace from the wild geese. While Akka flew her straight way with even wing strokes, the stork amused himself by performing a lot of flying tricks. Now he lay still at an immeasurable height, and floated in the air without moving his wings. Now he flung himself downward with such sudden haste that it seemed as though he would fall to the ground, helpless as a stone. Now he had lots of fun, flying all around Akka in great and small circles, like a whirlwind. The boy had never been on a ride of this sort before, and although he sat there all the while in terror, he had to acknowledge to himself that he had never before known what a good flight meant. Only a single pause was made during the journey, and that was at Vomb Lake, when Akka joined her travelling companions and called to them that the gray rats had been vanquished. After that the travellers flew straight to Kullaberg. There they descended to the knoll reserved for the wild geese, and as the boy let his glance wander from knoll to knoll, he saw on one of them the many pointed antlers of the stags, and on another the gray heron's neck crests. One knoll was red with foxes, one was gray with rats, one was covered with black ravens, who shrieked continually. one with larks who simply couldn't keep still, but kept on throwing themselves in the air and singing for very joy. Just as it has ever been the custom on Kullaberg, it was the crows who began the day's games and frolics with their flying dance. They divided themselves into two flocks that flew toward each other, met, turned, and began all over again. This dance had many repetitions, and appeared to the spectators who were not familiar with the dance as altogether too monotonous. The crows were very proud of their dance, but all the others were glad when it was over. It appeared to the animals about as gloomy and meaningless as the winter storm's play with the snowflakes. It depressed them to watch it, and they waited eagerly for something that should give them a little pleasure. They did not have to wait in vain, either, for as soon as the crows had finished, the hares came running. They dashed forward in a long row, without any apparent order. In some of the figures, one single hare came; in others they ran three and four abreast. They had all raised themselves on two legs, and they rushed forward with such rapidity that their long ears swayed in all directions. As they ran, they spun round, made high leaps, and beat their forepaws against their hind paws so that they rattled. Some performed a long succession of somersaults; others doubled themselves up and rolled over like wheels. One stood on one leg and swung round; one walked upon his forepaws. There was no regulation whatever, but there was much that was droll in the hares' play, and the many animals who stood and watched them began to breathe faster. Now it was spring. Joy and rapture were advancing. Winter was over, summer was coming. Soon it was only play to live. When the hares had romped themselves out, it was the great forest birds' turn to perform. Hundreds of wood grouse in shining dark brown array, and with bright red eyebrows, flung themselves up into a great oak that stood in the centre of the playground. The one who sat upon the topmost branch fluffed up his feathers, lowered his wings, and lifted his tail so that the white covert feathers were seen. Thereupon he stretched his neck and sent forth a couple of deep notes from his thick throat. "Chuck, chuck, chuck," it sounded. More than this he could not utter. It only gurgled a few times way down in the throat. Then he closed his eyes and whispered: "Sis, sis, sis! Hear how pretty! Sis, sis, sis!" At the same time he fell into such an ecstasy that he no longer knew what was going on around him. While the first wood grouse was sissing, the three nearest under him began to sing, and before they had finished their song, the 10 who sat lower down joined in, and thus it continued from branch to branch until the entire 100 grouse sang, and gurgled and sissed. They all fell into the same ecstasy during their song, and this affected the other animals like a contagious transport. Lately the blood had flowed lightly and agreeably; now it began to grow heavy and hot. "Yes, this is surely spring," thought all the animal folk. "Winter chill has vanished. The fires of spring burn over the earth." When the black grouse saw that the brown grouse were having such success, they could no longer keep quiet. As there was no tree for them to light on, they rushed down on the playground, where the heather stood so high that only their beautiful turned tail feathers and their thick bills were visible, and they began to sing: "Orr, orr, orr." Just as the black grouse began to compete with the brown grouse, something unprecedented happened. While all the animals thought of nothing but the grouse game, a fox stole slowly over to the wild geese knoll. He glided very cautiously, and came way up on the knoll before anyone noticed him. Suddenly a goose caught sight of him, and as she could not believe that a fox had sneaked in among the geese for any good purpose, she began to cry: "Have a care, wild geese! Have a care!" The fox struck her across the throat, mostly, perhaps, because he wanted to make her keep quiet; but the wild geese had already heard the cry, and they all raised themselves in the air. And when they had flown up, the animals saw Smirre Fox standing on the wild geese's knoll with a dead goose in.